Today on Panelism, we're talking about fantasy, when it is good to break the rules, and when, for some reason, it's not okay to break the rules. Welcome to Panelism, a podcast where we talk about the comics and graphic novels worth having on your shelf, and sometimes broader topics like today's. I'm Todd A.
I'm Taylor Trask. Broader topics, that sounds very vague. Like, what are we, are we talking about, I don't want to say anything without being offensive. Like,
I just clammed up because you specifically requested banter at the beginning of this. I'm like, how to banter?
I did. It's in my writer. It just, a thing pops up on our teleprompter, banter from Taylor.
Well, you told me not to go ahead and jump right into the topic. So how are you doing?
I'm doing well. We're recording this the day after we recorded our other podcast, Wednesday in Westeros. So it's kind of like a full schedule this week. We got, while we're doing two shows, it seems like, we got to.
Yeah. And that episode, because the Panelism shows tend to have a little more long life.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense.
Evergreen.
Yeah. I was trying to that evergreen. It makes sense, but it always sounds to me like when someone's like, wow, we've got some great content for you.
Oh yeah. Evergreen like content.
Weird buzzword.
It never spoils. It never goes bad. You can leave it on your kitchen counter all year long. That's our kind of content.
Well preserved. That Game of Thrones episode we should mention is season 8, episode 5, which was called The Bells, which I think is kind of puts a pin in where we are at this moment in history as we're going to talk about these broader topics.
Yeah, and we're actually, for those of you not aware, if you're still not aware that we host a second podcast, we are joined by our good friend Emily Kelly, who is just wonderful. So she's been on Panelism a few times in the past when it was called something else. Yep. But she's a fantastic addition to that show. If you want a female's perspective and a really good point of view, check out Wednesday in Westeros and just check out Emily Kelly in general. Yeah,
a female human's perspective, I would add.
A female human's perspective.
Not just a female.
A woman's perspective. There we go.
Well, we mentioned that on Wednesday in Westeros, so that she had crossed over onto Panelism a few times, and I had sort of thought, well, we should mention, like when we talked about the Wonder Woman movie, she joined us. Yep. When we talked about Logan, she joined us, and when we talked about Supergirl, she joined us. And we have an upcoming episode that has like a special guest starring clip from her because you and I both interviewed her on a specific topic about a comic book that I will discuss in the upcoming weeks.
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
I thought that was neat. It was cool that we did that and that we were both on the call together rather than me just calling her up and saying like, hey, I want to get a sound bite from you,
Yeah. Is it weird that Logan is already 2 years old now?
Yeah. Have you revisited it?
You know what? I'm glad you asked that. I haven't. And it's not for any reason that I didn't enjoy it. It's just because that was such a singular experience.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not easy to rewatch that because you're just like, it almost needs to be like you watch it, spoilers, he dies, and that's it. It's not, maybe there'll be a day where I just go back because I crave that team, that creative team, which, God damn, they did such a great job. But as good as it is, I haven't watched it again.
It's a tough rewatch for sure. And I almost feel like I would have to be in a dark movie theater.
Yeah.
It's sort of like stuck in there. Like, okay, I'm going to get through this, like no distractions because for one thing, it's so hard to watch Professor X. Like just,
God, yes.
It's just right. As delightful as X-23 is, which is not really delightful, like terrifying, but
well acted, well portrayed.
The Xavier story is just, it's hard.
You know what other movie I haven't watched since, and it's even older than that, but for similar reasons, Mad Max Fury Road. I kind of feel like I need to see that in a theater on a big screen or it's just not the same. Like that is an experience. You can't really replicate that at home unless you just have a massive little movie theater in your house or something if you're one of those people. Which God bless you, but
I did not see it in the theater, but I think what I did was I rented it at my parents' house one time where they had a huge TV, and I was able to, it was like, well, I missed this, I better catch up. But
that was 4 years ago. That was 4 years ago.
And I haven't seen the black and chrome edition. I'd really like to see that on an awesome
screen. There's a good point. There's a good reason to rewatch it.
Yeah. But again, you're right. It's almost like that Game of Thrones episode from a few weeks ago, The Long Night, where it's, the ideal viewing conditions are turn out all the lights, have the biggest screen possible.
Turn it to sports mode so you can see everything.
I'm curious about that black and chrome edition. I haven't seen it, but that's a good one too. Wow.
Yeah.
I had this note that I wouldn't have normally shared in the episode, except that you asked for banter, and now it's an awkward transition, which is, man, I'm not even making coffee at home anymore. I'm on Earl Grey tea, iced, with a shot of honey in it. That's what I'm doing these days. Yeah, no reaction.
Well, I just made coffee. I just made an AeroPress. If you're a fan,
coffee at like 6 p.m.
Well, I've had a long day, and I just it's something where if you make your own AeroPress and it's really good. We're going back to the coffee and comics days right now. If you make your own AeroPress and it is as delightful as mine is, you want it no matter the time.
Well, no, when you do that, are you doing a single shot of espresso?
Well, when it's an AeroPress, it's a 12. I do 12 ounces in an AeroPress, and then it's a single cup. It's a pretty condensed one. So
gotcha. Okay.
Anyway.
Yeah, I received a French press from a friend for for Christmas, I guess, and it was it's an adjustment, as you know. I'm a coffee Philistine.
Yeah.
Anyway, is that enough chit chat?
Yes, fine. It's enough banter. God,
I'm just like staring at an outline, going, I don't know how to transition to this. I'm the one who stupidly brought up brewed beverages. Yeah. We've mentioned Game of Thrones already in this intro, and a couple of topics that come up on Wednesday in Westeros that just got me thinking. And so this is, I would say it's a bit of an experiment in that you and I vaguely know what the other is going to talk about in a conversation about fantasy, but it's sort of like a really old, like episode 7 and 8 kind of things where if we just pick a topic like spy movies, that could go anywhere, you know?
Or like what is sci-fi? I remember that.
Yeah,
kind of in a similar vein to what we're about to talk about.
In fact, I was going to touch upon that, so I'm glad you brought up that specific episode because that kind of reminds me of it. But I'll tell you where I got into thinking about this was through Game of Thrones, and you'll hear on Wednesday in Westeros a couple weeks ago, I was like, don't get me started on my feudalism and fantasy like rant, and it. I started sort of pondering fantasy in general, and as you and eagle-eared listeners of this podcast know, like I've gotten into the world of Dungeons and Dragons after a long hiatus of, when I was a child, having the sets and never really playing it because I didn't have friends that wanted to play it. And so I'm surrounded by Dungeons and Dragons on TV and, in my like social life and everything like that. And there's definitely this template, this a medieval fantasy template that is what we talk about when we talk about fantasy. Like I think that most times when you say fantasy, people think you're going to talk about dragons or something like that.
Well, what about something like Saga? The graphic novel series. That is definitely. In my mind, is definitely fantasy. I'm sure you could argue that it's sci-fi too, but it feels like it's a fantasy epic in a sci-fi context. But that to me more and more seems like what fantasy is moving forward, meaning that a lot of creators are stretching that boundary pretty broad.
Yeah. Well, and but why not? That's why I'm glad you brought up that sci-fi episode. We talked about Saga on that sci-fi episode. We should figure out what episode that was because it was seriously like our 8th or 9th. It was so
long time ago.
And we were sort of like relying on different tropes or subgenres of fantasy. Like, is this sci-fi? Is this fantasy sci-fi, or is it hard sci-fi, or what? Low sci-fi or soft? I don't remember. But in fantasy we talk about high fantasy and low fantasy, and generally that sort of has to do with how many weird creatures and how much magic is in it.
Let's be honest, though. The general public does not. They just think of fantasy and sci-fi. And so it's like when you get really nuanced about it, a lot of people look at you kind of like, why is this important? I mean, it is to people, but
so I think what's interested me in this lately is this idea that when you say fantasy, it conjures that image of like a dragon, or it is a medieval template that they're thinking of. And then they automatically sort of imprint upon it this old idea, like I think one of the most radical things George Lucas did was to have Star Wars, the first movie, which I will always refer to by that name, having the crawl say, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away,
so that it's not the future.
And right. And that was so radical of like, oh, wow, it is sort of like medieval, and it's a space opera, and it's like a swashbuckler and a samurai film. And this happened a long time ago. It didn't happen. It's not happening later in the future. It's not Star Trek, when, for example, on our show last night of Wednesday in Westeros, you brought up this point about, if Daenerys really wanted to be the breaker of chains, she should have founded something that looked like a democracy. That would have been like super radical. And I have also suggested that in years past with a friend who said, he was like, you're looking at it wrong. Like you're looking at it as a modern person. And that's not what they would do in that context. And so why do we assume this is old? Because it looks like medieval. And two, the Greeks and Romans had democratic republics hundreds of years before the Middle Ages and medieval times.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great point. Oh my God.
And so, and that's really where I'm interested in this. I recently picked up a book on Celtic myths, which I don't know a lot about. And the very first one I started reading talked about how this myth was basically rewritten once Ireland became Christianized. So this was a pagan Celtic myth that over the years, because I'm sure it was like oral tradition kind of thing. Now it ends in this weird thing where the priests come and cure the cursed people in it. But so I don't know. I don't have any good answers here. I'm not an historian, but I do wonder if there's this weird thing of like thinking of fantasy as medieval and having to do with dragons and knights and swords and shit like that is a Eurocentric. I mean, it has to be, right? It is a Eurocentric and maybe specifically Christianized version of things.
Christian version is that's apt because think about how much fantasy, just in the general term, kind of fits that mold. Even Lord of the Rings, for God's sake, is a giant Christian allegory to a lot of people. Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, giant Christian allegory, like all these kind of fantastical things. What you'd never really see in terms of quote unquote fantasy is Asian or Chinese inspired myths, which are probably even more epic. They last. I mean, think about Chinese culture in particular has been around a lot longer than most of Europe. By far. There's a wonderful scene in a recent Wicked and Divine issue where the whole issue is just the same panel over the course of every 70 years, I believe. Is that
right? Where the people are reborn.
Yeah, and it shows what happens every single cycle from the very beginning, like the earliest of man to now, and like half of them are Chinese. Like half of them are just because that's how long China has been around. So it's interesting to me that so much of that culture and that heritage and that version of fantasy is not prevalent in the global consciousness. And I do think it is largely due to just the Crusades and Christianity and that coloring of what fantasy has become to a lot of people. Take the most cliche of all fantasy tropes, Arthurian lore.
Yeah.
Like, what is Arthurian lore? But I mean, that's almost just a giant Christian allegory too.
Yeah. Well, no, that's a great example because that recently I rewatched Excalibur, and which is a pretty funny film to go back and watch, like the actual R-rated Excalibur. But it had me thinking all of a sudden, all over again of, okay, so these are knights, like this is around Crusade period time. Like it's historically set and they have magicians and like, so all this, can't speak intelligently enough about how other cultures do it. I guess I just see what my culture has done to it, and that is that the Christian way of conquering was to come into a place and take over all of their traditions as their own.
Yeah, true.
Like Saturnalia becomes Christmas. The like rites of spring become Easter, and things like that. Like it's.
But just imagine the trope of the hero, male or female, riding in on a mission from God, or a mission like they're not even necessarily from God, but you think about Daenerys, like she's on this mission, this anointed to become this savior, this Messiah.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, that all straight. It's not like she's come to break Cersei and then she goes off into the sunset on her own. Like no, I'm here to, I have been chosen by whatever force you believe in to be the breaker of chains, be this mythic figure to take over and install Targaryen rule and Targaryen culture. And it's all the things that come after the takeover that we never really get a sense of in a lot of fantasy. Yeah. You think about, just think about every fantasy story where the ending is, and he was crowned king.
Yeah, happily ever after.
It's like, what then? Yeah, and then Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Narnia, the books kind of give us a sense of that in each subsequent one, especially the second one. I forget the title, but that flashes forward 1,000 years into Narnia's future after they're all, the legend of those 4 kids as kings and queens has passed. Their castle is just rubble, and then so that everything is kind of set in motion since then. So you get a sense of that, but it's still, these stories rarely give you the what next. It always sort of ends on, and they were crowned king and queen. And that is the moral of the story, is that sort of that takeover, that influence at that high level is all that matters.
Well, I mean, I'm so glad you brought up Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, because I wasn't even thinking of them. I was thinking on like the purely like sort of mythical level.
Oh, okay.
But even a recent example of that is how the Lord of the Rings movies did not include the last chapter. Things weren't happily ever after in the book.
Oh, you're right. The Scourge of the Shire. Yeah.
What an interesting thing. Like I really didn't put that together. It's almost like I think that was Tolkien like trying to deconstruct his own like perfect fantasy kind of thing.
Well, a lot of it was based on his horror at World War II.
Right,
I mean,
right.
As many people who think it's like a Christian allegory, it's a World War II allegory, first and foremost. Let's just be clear. You can insert as much Christianity as you want into it, and granted, there is some of that, but it's a World War II allegory, first and foremost, people. So the Scourging of the Shire is, in his mind's eye, what Britain would have become if the Nazis had taken over.
Right. Exactly.
If Britain had fallen, this is sort of like him playing out that paranoia of what would have happened to this beautiful green countryside once this dark entity took over. It would have been, I understand why they took it out of the movies. It just would have felt really disjointed, especially alongside all the multiple endings that everybody constantly complained about. I just don't, but you're right. In the case of that, it was towards the end, he almost kind of has his cake and eats it too. Aragorn is crowned king and he ruled justly forever and ever. You have that. But then Frodo's POV is one of PTSD and strife and never truly satisfied. Never, like, he went through this experience and he was never whole again. Yeah. And I appreciate that part of it, because that really does speak to what does happen in some of these stories. Like, hey, sometimes the hero doesn't make it out the same person or a whole person, or they're irreparably damaged having been a hero. I'm sure there's earlier versions of that theme, but that I'm so glad we have a semi-modern starting point for that.
Well, I think I can only speak to the myths that I'm familiar with, which are largely like Anglo-Saxon and Greek and Roman, of course, and then Norse.
Yeah.
And there is definitely like there's an I don't know, there's an interest in Norse myths in our culture for sure. And there's an idea that we understand the Vikings as like, their images are shown all over, like in Game of Thrones last night. That image of the Northern army standing outside King's Landing, I thought was very Viking-esque, the rough hewn, bearded sort of just ugly, people from up north. Like, they were just rough compared to the people in the beautiful leather armor and, great hats.
Yeah.
But when you read the myths, they're fucking crazy. And they don't have they never have happy endings. And they're all so weird. And it's just, it's a huge disconnect. And I think that's why, again, when we speak for my culture, I think that's why, like, Americans never, like, as much as we're interested in it, it never took hold as sort of the template for our fantasy, because it's so messy and crazy. I mean, there were those people that were irrevocably damaged, and
it's like we cherry picked the best bits out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
And left the rest behind, left the context of the rest of it, the hard life, the dark nights.
Yeah.
When it's long winters, all of that behind.
Right. No, that's a great point. And, like, and to contrast that with Greek myths, I think is interesting, where they were all very representative of something. And we're always taught, or at least I was, we had a large, amount of Greek myths sort of drilled into us in school in order to understand literature. And so you're taught that, like, everything's an allegory, everything represents something else, everything's a symbol. And then, so when you read the Norse myths, you're like, well, this is just nuts. What's going on? Like, where's the literal world in this Yggdrasil, like, world tree? I don't understand what's going, how is there a snake wrapped around the earth? Like, none of it makes any sense. And the gods don't seem to have, like, they have a real flexible view on morality and things like that. It's not allegory or actually it's maybe a more perfect allegory, which is that being human is messy. But
I kind of feel like, to have this conversation in full, each of us and even our listeners need to read the works of Joseph Campbell, specifically The Hero with 1,000 Faces and The Masks of a God, even Historical Atlas of World Mythology. But I mean, I think at this point, if you pay attention, you kind of know a lot of that. But just Hero with 1,000 Faces is interesting. It's, as you were talking, I was wondering, my mind's eye, what fantasy as a genre, as a container of story that sort of all is interrelated, is truly a Eurocentric, Anglocentric package. I already mentioned Asia, China, but think about somebody who lives in Peru, or somebody at the foot of Machu Picchu. Like, what is their version of fantasy? It clearly isn't anything we've just described. It's not the Norse gods. It's not a king and a queen riding into a castle and taking it over with a wizard standing. But it's none of that. And it makes me wonder, like, how limited we might be. Think about, let's take it back to Game of Thrones for a second. One of the appeals of that show is that it takes fantasy cliches and tropes and subverts them. Yeah. It gives you season 1, for God's sake. It builds up your classic cliche hero in Ned Stark, and then it kills him at the end, and not even at the end, like before the end. It's like, and he's dead. And you're like, whoa. And that's the moment, I think, that hooks everybody, where it's like, oh, if that can happen, anything can happen. Anything I assumed is up for grabs. So that's important. But at some point, even that's going to run its course. I wonder how much richer we'd be as a global society of readers and people who love story. How much richer we'd be if we were more actively looking for non-Eurocentric, Anglocentric, quote unquote fantasy. If we were more attuned to South American fantasy and Chinese fantasy, and I mean, there is one sort of exception to this rule, which is Arabian Nights, which is sort of as lauded, if you will, as Arthurian legend. I remember even going to the library in my little hometown in South Dakota, and those two books were sitting right beside each other, like Camelot and the Arabian Nights were right there. And so you kind of think of both of those. So Arabian, and that's maybe just because of the success of that collection of stories and Arabian myth, and good Lord, Aladdin's coming out as a live action movie soon. So we do celebrate that. That isn't a Eurocentric, Anglo-centric thing, but that's like the only exception that I can think of.
Not a total. I mean, it never hit that huge of an audience, but we should name drop the Crescent Moon Kingdoms series by Saladin Ahmed, which is he's actually an American author, but it is set in the Middle East and is like that is where it draws its fantasy from and its whole story. And have not, full confession, have not read the first book is Throne of the Crescent Moon. I have not read that, or I don't even know if the others exist. But it's received such high praise, and it's, on my to read list.
Can I inject, as you're saying that, then the thought occurred to me, can I inject another layer to this?
Yeah.
Which goes back to another episode from our past where we talked about hard power versus soft power and the Rose-Tycho test. I forget which episode number that is. You can look it up. We delve into that pretty specifically around Star Wars, but I'm going to apply it here too. You think about and let's just really say an American audience, because as powerful as China is with the global box office, it's still an American audience that drives a lot of the creative choices. I do wonder if Arabian Nights and all those interrelated stories are held to such a higher, are held to a higher state of consciousness or awareness, because most of those stories are hard power. It is, think about, just take the story of Aladdin's lamp. It is, a young man who's chosen by fate to find this mythic thing and use it to become king of the land, or rise to the station, and they lived happily ever after. It's the same motif, right? Yeah. But it's all hard power based. It's all like, hey, this guy uses strength to take over and rule the land justly. Whereas think about something like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Not necessarily myth, but I would argue is probably, in a lot of it, by every definition, is probably considered fantasy, Asian-based fantasy, but very soft power. As cool as those fight scenes are, it's still very much a soft power kind of story, I think. Maybe, convince me otherwise, you or our listeners, but I feel like that is a different kind of thing, and I would wonder if a lot of these Chinese fantasy myths are based on soft power. Like, I think, what's the one story, like the Monkey King? There's like a whole subgenre of, I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, the book on Celtic mythology that I was reading recently, I bought it as part of some crazy Amazon deal on like all of these separate volumes of mythology from everywhere. So I believe I have a Chinese mythology in there and a Japanese mythology, and
what's the name of this book? I want to get this. What is it?
I literally think it's called Celtic mythology.
Why are there Chinese stories in there?
No. There's like separate books. They had those they had those Kindle deals where it was like 3 of them for $5.99 or something. So the packages I bought had all of these different, like a different book on, Celtic and Egyptian and South American or whatever.
Ooh,
so
Egyptian fantasy is another. I totally neglected that.
Yeah.
Where do you think that sits in the global consciousness? Egyptian mythology. We've had some movies and stories, obviously, and there's been a lot of mashups.
Egyptian mythology. That's.
In a weird. This is probably you're probably too old for this, but one of my go-to references for modern Egyptian mythology is the anime Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is largely based on sort of like, especially towards the end, the last season, they just go full Egypt. But it is hard power all the way down. But not anything.
That is a Japanese take on Egyptian mythology, right?
Yeah, it's a total mashup. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's
I don't know. I don't know. It's all a fertile field for us to like sort of draw from all of these mythologies. I'm curious, as you're saying that, like how much of this overlapped in history, when, because we tend to think of it as sort of, as Western students, we tend to think of it as like a timeline. First there was Egypt, then there was Greece, then there was Rome, then there were like the European myths, then there was America. And that's a totally stupid way to look at it. Like so many of these things are happening in parallel, and to circle back to something I said at the beginning, like when we watch medieval templated fantasy and we like to think of it as being a long time ago, and they wouldn't have things like democracy or, in Game of Thrones, I remember we were all made very uncomfortable about Joffrey's homophobia, and to think of like, well, but if we were in a historical context and this came after Greece, I mean, the Middle Ages and sort of the Dark Ages period were in large part like driven by the church, and a specific like rejection of all the knowledge that the world had previously been developing from Egypt and Greece and Rome. And, that, I don't know. It's not a great thing, not a great time period to choose to template everything off of. But to kind of get back to where we started, which, although I love these diversions, I think that once we get in any context like that, the whole idea of using fantasy is to be able to examine all of these things like history and culture and sex and violence and race without it being in our current, setting. And that way we can look at it through this different lens of like, what if we gave this group of people ultimate power? Why don't we see medieval fantasies that are matriarchies? Like that would be amazing to see a Eurocentric matriarchy medieval fantasy, or just.
Do you think that's why a lot of people were irrationally upset, in my opinion, that Daenerys didn't fulfill that particular? I think a lot of people were on board with Team Dany because it was headed that direction. It's like, oh, this is going to end with a matriarchy run by this benign, benevolent woman riding her dragons in. Yeah. And when that hasn't happened, it's like, oh, then, or if it does happen, it's going to be because she's just as shitty as all the men. Do you think that's subconsciously what's behind a lot of that angst? Is that everybody was sort of craving that evolution of fantasy to something like that, and then we're turning out not to be that?
I would bet that's a pretty big percentage. I mean, it's a really interesting thought because I would have accepted a Daenerys like queendom if that's what it turned into.
Yeah.
It's so weird the way Game of Thrones did it, because I don't think they exactly pulled the rug out from under us. I think our co-host Emily's observation about nature versus nurture and how Daenerys literally had no chance to be like a peaceful queen. She was raised, and tempered by all these experiences in her life to be like a strong man kind of leader and a violent leader.
But think about, we do have signposts in history for either not necessarily a matriarchy in the official sense, but a lot of women who crushed it for a long time. Think about just England alone. You've got Queen Victoria. You've got the current queen. You've got all these queens down the line. Spain had Queen Isabel, who basically funded the exploration of the New World. Egypt had all kinds of queens throughout its sort of prominence as a kingdom. This goes back. This isn't like, these aren't like few and far between. There's a lot of evidence of women in these powerful roles. It's interesting then that most of modern day fantasy doesn't still. Daenerys is almost sui generis in that context, and that's surprising to me. It's surprising that we haven't had. Joan of Arc to some extent, which is it was real, but still like a lot of the Joan of Arc stories kind of sub for that, I guess. But other than that, there's just that in Game of Thrones. Where else have we seen these stories? What do you think that's about? Why do you think that's been sort of hidden, even though it's obvious to anybody who studies history?
Well, that's super interesting, because even just setting it with a powerful queen or even just like a rich queen, like that Isabella point is amazing. But I would say that my counter to that, and I'm not trying to argue this like in any way, is just that though we had powerful queens in European history, they did not exist in a matriarchy, because they still were under like the patriarchy of, if they had a son, the kingdom was going to that son, not the daughter they had, they were only queens sort of at the inconvenience of a man's death or something like that.
Yeah. And I guess at that time, like the tools to the scribes were all still men. So the tools and distribution of story was still controlled by either men in a religious sense or just men in general. So it wasn't like there's, women out there could be like, this is inspiring me to write a story about another queen. Like that message couldn't spread nearly as quickly. They could control and tamp it down.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there are modern fantasy stories that explore all these things. And so, if you listener know of these things, please let us know. I hate being
There's a lot of tying it back to comics. There's plenty of comics and graphic novels.
Yeah. I'm glad you led into that, because I think that's that's where we're seeing a big explosion of this stuff. And I know we're all already all over the fantasy map, but I do, I see this large growth of like female creators in comics specifically, and I just wonder if I don't know. That's so weird. I almost said that, and then I remember as a child, like the first fantasy series I was really aware of, like after C.S. Lewis, was probably Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Song, Dragon Flight. Like I read several of those novels, which are all about dragons and stuff. And
who's the lead character in those?
I have no idea. I do not remember this at all. Like I just know I read them, but I was like 12 years old or something.
Think about this. See, let's bring this really to the present, or more or less the present. When you were a kid, so in this late 70s, 80s, reading stories, a lot. Think about, on one hand, you have King Arthur, young boy who's raised by a wizard to be true and just and basically fulfill this destiny and everything. Yeah, and he's got some challenges along the way, but everything kind of seems to go well for him. On the other side, the classic stories outside of C.S. Lewis that have a female protagonist, or female character at the center: Alice in Wonderland, Wizard of Oz. Two girls who are in these crazy psychedelic surrealist mindscapes, and everything everything that could possibly go wrong. It's like they don't have any agency in those stories, or nearly as much as the boys do in the other stories. So it's sort of like when we do, and I'm even thinking, God, even in more modern context, I Hate Fairyland is that on an extreme example. You've got Gertrude in Scotty Young's amazing graphic novel series, which is now concluded. You got Gertrude as an extreme version of this girl in this fantastical landscape, and just everything goes wrong. She can't get out of it. She's trying to find her way home. It doesn't happen. She meets friends along the way and has some luck, but it's constantly like the world is against her, and she's just fighting to make it, to achieve this thing that you don't know if she's ever gonna. Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz is a great example, because she makes it back to Kansas after the first book, but there are so many Oz books where she gets sucked back in again, and just constantly having to deal with all this nonsense.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Those are, I would consider Alice in Wonderland, Oz, all of that is fantasy in my mind.
True. I'm only saying this because it is a point of interest to me, not as a criticism of your examples, because those are perfect examples, but all men writers. My mind jumped to Mary Shelley, which is not a book about like Frankenstein is not a book about like a female protagonist, So I'm kind of like stumbling for that. I mean, we had Ursula Le Guin in like sci-fi. I'm curious. I guess once we break into like sci-fi and Frankenstein fantasy kind of territory, then we're out of the fantasy genre in a way. But I guess where this specifically impacts me is when now, if all the people who are upset by Daenerys's burning of the city in last night's episode of Game of Thrones, or 2 nights ago, if they were sincerely bummed because they thought she was going to install like a matriarchy, that's a legitimate bumming out, I guess. But I think that like the same people who are bummed about that, I don't know, this is a huge assumption, might be people that were pushed back on us when we suggested, why doesn't she start a democracy? Because that's not like, quote, realistic or something. And it's and that, I guess, is where I want it to go, or where I want to like pick apart, why do we feel that way? Why do we feel that there are rules to this fantasy, even though just because we set it in like a medieval look, And I think the culture would get richer if we started to examine issues like the slavery in Essos and the divine right of kings and all that. Like if you looked at that and you went like, we know how it was in history, let's put everybody in those same costumes and then shred that those ideas and deconstruct them completely. Like, then what does it look like? And what is, what's the capacity for fantasy and stuff? And this is a thing that comes up because when I play Dungeons and Dragons, you're always, I understand that you have to have some guardrails for the rules to work, but those rules aren't necessarily, medieval or in any way like that. Well, you're always bumping up against other things where people want it to be quote realistic in some way of like, well, of course a party is going to be mostly men.
Aren't there versions of D&D where it's like it's space or it's not the classic Dungeons and Dragons motif, but there's offshoots? I mean, granted, the classic D&D is sort of the most popular, but I've heard of people doing like, hey, we're going to do Avengers D&D or Space Station D&D or just like something. It's interesting that it probably stands reason that those aren't as popular or as well known because they do sort of deviate too far from the central themes.
I don't.
Magic the Gathering's another. Let's bring that into it too, because all those, especially those early decks, were all classic, fantasy and the grounded earth-based. Think about the mana cards and Magic. It's mountains, it's forests, it's oceans, it's plains, it's swamps. It's all these things that have colored fantasy storytelling for years and years and years and years. So and you can have some of the newer Magic decks have much more fantastical, much more like Final Fantasy almost, where it's kind of a sci-fi fantasy hybrid. But it still goes back to those same motifs.
Yeah. Well, I have a crazy question related to that. So, did or does Magic the Gathering, because I've never played it and I don't know too much about the culture, but does it, is it known for being largely a men's area?
I don't think
and
so.
a boys club.
When you see players at a comic shop, that tends to be the case.
Right.
There are a lot of female Magic players or lady Magic players out there that are wonderful, and I'm sure there's then there's cliche ones and non-cliche ones, and it ranges a wide gamut. But when you look at the kind of the standard people who play all the time, it tends to be dudes. As far as the cards and the lore and the story goes, there's a lot of female characters in Magic, a lot, and a lot of them are really well. Yeah, there's the over the top, highly sexualized cards, but then there's also like really freaking great Valkyrie kinds of characters, or just female mages, or things that are a lot classier and a lot more. And that was even going way back to the beginning. I remember buying my first deck, and I'm not even the biggest Magic player ever. I've almost kind of collected them over the years, almost like comics, where it's like I'm buying these as art, and you can play with them from time to time too, but the artistic endeavor was intriguing to me. But even back in 1995, 96, early days of Magic, a lot of those cards have some really killer female characters that are not through the male gaze, that they are very, very high. It's like high art, it's high fantasy, if you want to go that route.
The reason I actually asked that was because I've never, as an outsider, granted not in the culture, but I never perceived Magic as much of a boys club as even like D&D. And I think D&D is definitely they've opened the doors. I think Wizards of the Coast has done this great job of, I think they're doing a pretty good job of promoting it equally. Like it's not, no one from the Dungeons and Dragons company is making it a boys game.
Yeah.
But I definitely, when I go play in public games and stuff, it's unbelievably dominated by men. And, I have run into a couple of coarse comments or something where I wonder if it's is this because we're in a male space that you feel comfortable saying that, or are you socially awkward and that was meant to be a joke kind of thing, that sort of thing. It's never struck me as like a men's rights rally or something. Is what I'm trying to say. It could just be awkwardness.
Think about this, and we kind of had this conversation in our pre-discussion about just corporations a la Disney buying all the content.
Yeah.
Think about who owns. I mean, Wizards of the Coast bought Dungeons and Dragons in the late 90s. I think 97, 98, somewhere around there. Hasbro bought Wizards of the Coast. So Hasbro owns all of it. And soon Disney will own that too, and then we'll just be one giant thing. All the fictional realities will just collapse into Disney. But Hasbro has, as a giant corporation, has the imperative to try to expand the footprint, the demographic footprint of all their products. So it would stand to reason that we're gonna stay grounded in what we came from, but at the same time we're gonna try to get young girls to be into this and not make it just this weird ultra boys, nerdy boys thing, which there's some of it could be that, but I like that they're expanding. But that is you're seeing a lot of that through the edicts of a corporation trying to make it reach more people, make it more accessible, more compatible, and which is interesting because it's like you'd think that a corporation would just. I mean, some people I'm sure think that they're ruining it, but you'd think that would tarnish and try to bring out the worst in that property, and instead of kind of making it more broad, more wide ranging, more appealing.
Well, I do think that one of the very exciting things about it is about the game Dungeons and Dragons is that I mean I could talk endlessly with mostly constructive criticism on mechanics or the way that those mechanics are explained, but I think they've done a very good job of making it where the rules and the mechanics of the game are separate from the culture of however you're playing. You could run a totally racist men's rights game in it for sure, but that's not something that is built into the construction of the game.
That's your choice, right? Your application of it.
So you could you absolutely. It's only limited by your imagination. So if you want to set up this matriarchy that's like a steampunk / swords and sorcery / sci-fi matriarchy, you can do it and just live in that world and play that game. That would be awesome. So yeah, I guess in that way, it's actually more limitless than the sort of the culture we absorb in movies and TV, because those are the things that seem, in order to appeal to the broadest audience, have to play on the scenery and the settings that we're so comfortable and familiar with, so I don't know. I love having all this, thinking about all of this in the context of fantasy. And especially because of how we mentioned on our Wednesday in Westeros show last night, Game of Thrones, for all its faults and problems, is undeniably one of the biggest fantasy, properties, productions. Yeah. Everything, books, just everything about it is huge. I mean, we give George Martin shit for not finishing the novels, but I mean, that World of Ice and Fire book that we talk about all the time is unbelievable. This is just such a gift to people who love fantasy. And I don't know, am I stumbling towards a conclusion or what? I know you had some thoughts about audience reactions and stuff, and I don't know if we want to get in on that, because I feel like I
don't know. I've kind of been hesitating because where we were going was a little bit in a different direction. I was going to inject this idea that we've arrived in a fan culture where a lot of things are going wrong, as we've sort of diagnosed in previous episodes. But what seems to be happening more and more is a lot of fans are using the genres of fantasy or sci-fi they're expecting something that matches their own worldview, either politically, socioeconomically, all of the above. Right. And they are expecting that out of it. I think that's almost another episode we could dive into. Yeah. That takes us in all kinds of directions. But I'll just kind of say in this case, going back, using the Game of Thrones comparison, I think, a lot of people did want that show to make a statement about the matriarchy, or to make a definitive statement. And that's not necessarily what that story was going to be. Yeah. And you get people, and you could even bring in, a lot of the fan consternation about The Last Jedi, even though we talked about that in a previous episode too. It's kind of the same. Yeah, there was a lot of bigoted, kind of ridiculous stuff, but a lot of fans were like, this is not the story that I wanted. Yeah. This is not the story that I thought it should be. And it's like, well, yeah, but then write your own thing. If you want to see your worldview, whatever it is, good, bad, or ugly, represented in a thing you like, and it doesn't do that, that's not the thing's fault. That's your fault for bringing and hoisting those expectations onto that thing. For using the genre of fantasy, or the package of fantasy the package of Star Wars to tell that story. And it's like, that's not, I mean, think about if Harry Potter started new now, I wonder if it wouldn't have suffered from a lot more of that. It's like almost Harry Potter snuck in under the wire before this really started ramping up, where I don't recall a single time the Harry Potter audience was like, well, I mean, You do now, because J.K. Rowling keeps messing it up by coming forward and saying, well, this is what, she keeps retconning stuff in that was never apparent the first time around, which I have huge problems with, but whatever, it's her story. So she's almost retroactively doing it. But at the time of both the books and the original run of movies airing, you didn't hear a lot of people saying, well, that's not what, Draco should have been this. And it's like, none of that was ever the thing. It's like people would discuss it and talk about it like we do Game of Thrones. There's plenty of podcasts about Harry Potter, but it was always about the appreciation of it and the speculation on what's to come, and not, oh, this does not fit what I thought Hermione was supposed to be. Hermione was going to be a lesbian hero. And it's like, that was never part of it. But now I wonder, now if Harry Potter had started new, like, would there be a group of people who by no fault but their own would assume this character like Luna was meant to be, was meant to represent this, and it's like, that's not.
I mean, that's a perfect way to tie it back up. You're totally right. Harry Potter snuck in under the wire, and that is the internet wire. Like, it got to live its full life before social media.
Yep.
So yes, there was social media when the movies were coming out, but the canon had already been established. So
the social media just promoted it. It didn't rip it apart in 1,000 different shards that had to represent every single audience member.
It wasn't being created as it was being commented upon in real time in that way. I mean, obviously there were critics and stuff, but just to double onto what you're saying, like, the Hermione story, or the, Rose in Last Jedi, or what, like, it's a fucking fantasy, people. I mean, it can go any way. And I think what's important to the creator is to stay true to what they think is their characters.
Boom.
That's
it. Well, let me ask, I'm so glad you said that. Let me ask you this, because this is hugely important. Have we crossed the Rubicon into a world where more and more and more, everybody's going to demand, because we have so much access to whatever we want, whenever we want, we can build our entertainment libraries or diets in exactly the way we want. I feel like that is subconsciously or consciously influencing fans to demand that every story be their story. Are we moving further and further away from a dictatorial creative ecosystem, meaning that the George Lucases and George R.R. Martins of the world, where it's like, look, this is my story. Whatever I want is going to happen. You can enjoy it or not, but that is the only choice you get, to say, yes, I'm going to enjoy this, or no, I'm not. And then if you don't, find something else. It seems like we're moving away from that into, no, I want Star Wars to be exactly this, or I want Game of Thrones to be exactly this. Like, this is what it means. And instead of just writing your own version of that or creating your own world, we were almost kind of in this weird middle area where I would imagine in 10 to 15 years, you're going to be able to fire up an app on your phone and write whatever version, like literally, CGI,
you can already do that.
Version.
Go ahead and do it. Like, I guess that's
no, but I mean, even like take it even further and like literally create
video or something.
Make a Star Wars, like you have your fully rendered CGI characters, and you can make them do and say whatever you want, and you can watch. I mean, we're going to get there eventually, and we're almost kind of in this middle area where the expectation is for that, but the technology and tools aren't quite there yet for the mass populace. Do you think that's where we're headed, and is that good?
I don't know that. I don't know. It's I don't know that population of people that are that grumpy about that stuff actually is growing. Only that they're at sometimes louder, and their intensity changes. But I do believe that it's just like you said earlier. It's like if that's not the story you wanted, go write your story.
Yeah.
But because you'll find out it's way harder than you think it is.
Oh, 100%.
And to some extent, it's dangerous for Disney or anyone else to keep acquiring these big properties, because then the expectations and the trying to balance the expectations of a very hardcore fan group along with like mass appeal is more and more difficult. But the other thing is that this, all of this feeds back into that point that introduced this whole topic for our podcast, which was I don't know why people want fantasy to play by some basically arbitrary rules that fit into something. And the example I had as you were talking about one of those things was thinking of the I don't know how to say this without mentioning like, just the word politics, but there's definitely like politics. There's a political view on when something gets changed, or like, just like The Last Jedi, there's sort of a political perspective that's lent to why there were so many women in that movie, as though, well, the rules had been set up that it was mostly men. So now that you've made a movie with mostly women, you're breaking the rules. And, and it's like, yeah, why do you apply the rules there? Anyway, this is one of those weird things where, when X-23 took over the Wolverine mantle, or Jane Seymour, what's her name? Jane, what's Foster?
Jane Foster
lifted the hammer of Thor. I know.
Dr. Quinn Thor.
Where people were arbitrarily upset about that. And the example I always gave was, when I was a kid, Captain Marvel was a black woman in a black and white costume, and Thor was a horse. Like, I don't, these things change. Like, these are not set in stone. Everything is fantasy is fantasy. I mean, for Christ's sake, like
it is like, but it is like, I mean, let's go back to Harry Potter. I think a lot of people, myself included, are a little agitated right now because J.K. Rowling herself is breaking the rules that she had set up. And I'm not even just saying like Dumbledore is gay. Like, I don't care about that. That's fine. Great. That's, if you can get more story out of it, fine. But she's going back. Like, even what bothers me more is that, Nagini is now a woman who is perfectly benign, and somehow she's going to end up being this evil snake that is Voldemort's best friend. Like, no, that was never, like, don't do that. The rule you set up was that this snake was this thing. So it's almost like the creator, there's a grace period where it's like, okay, I'm creating a new world. Here's what everything is. But then the public does not let that creator make any adjustments. Once that world is set, God damn it, you better keep to those rules or we're going to throw a fit. And I think that's what you're seeing more and more.
Yeah.
And in the case of Game of Thrones, it's, this is what we thought the rules were, even though the show isn't done yet. The story's not done yet. So it can still evolve. And to our point, I think you and I agree that everything we're seeing is obeying by those rules.
Yeah.
Just a lot of people thought the rules were different. In the case of Star Wars, you already nailed it. Like, that was sort of set up from the beginning as a male-centric story. So when you start to introduce a lot of female characters, as badass as they may be, good contingent of the fan base got pretty.
Well, I mean, think, it was pre-internet mob days, but think of like Arwen in Lord of the Rings, and what how much that provoked things. Like, I got that name right? Like Liz Tyler's character.
No,
or Eowyn,
oh fuck, Arwen is the blonde, I believe. No,
is that bad? Anyway, they're like, oh, they're just trying to, put all these girls in it to be politically correct. They put one woman in it. It was just one.
Was that a thing? I don't even remember that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. And I just,
it is Arwen. You are correct. I'm sorry. Okay. And who am I thinking of? I'm thinking of oh God, hang on. Keep going. I'll look.
You may be thinking of Eowyn.
I am. You're right. I'm absolutely. Yeah.
This is only fresh in my mind because I was corrected very recently. So, so do not feel bad. But anyway, I really appreciate you bringing up the Harry Potter stuff, because it is great to for both of us to show an example of the hill we're going to die on rather than let the creators have their say. And for me, I think it's the Star Wars original trilogy and all the fixes to it that drove me fucking crazy, well, and though the creator in me is like, bless, go for it, George, you make it what you wanted. And the fan in me is like, fuck you, Han shot first.
Well, I have a weird position on this. Like, I was completely fine with the re-edits on the original trilogy, because I'm like, okay, fine. He says he didn't have the technology to do what he really wanted, and you can bitch about some of the scenes, but I mean, the Death Star blowing up in the re-edit is awesome. It's way cooler than the first one. I mean, the effects
I don't actually
are
mind
better.
That part. It's only the characters. It's really just the Han Solo moment. It's the busyness of Empire drives me crazy. How there's like little droids and gadgets everywhere.
Oh yeah, that was just,
because. I get it that that's a budget thing, but it made such a cooler set that, like, God, you're on this desert planet or whatever, and there's nothing there.
Yeah.
You have this massive technology and there's nothing.
what bothered me more was the prequels, where it's like, oh, the Force is now due to these genetically passed like cells that only special people get. I'm like, wait, what? Like you just rewrote the rules to what the Force was, even though it's the same guy. And you could argue, well, this is even more his story because he had complete control. There was no Larry Kasdan or anybody else from the original trilogy like helping him. It was all him completely. So you could say, well, this is even more his vision. And but I'm even finding myself falling into that same trap of like, but these aren't the rules you set up. You told us that this was the way the universe worked, and now you're sort of you're rejiggering it, and it's not. It creates a dissonance, I think, or a friction in a fan's head, especially with something as beloved as Star Wars, Harry Potter, etc., where it's just like, man, there's other ways you could have done it without ruining the core canon.
I think that the midichlorians, I mean, man, what a weird hill to fight on. But I'm with you is what I mean. But like because it fundamentally alters a thing about which we suspended disbelief. We specifically like suspended disbelief to believe in this magic. And then he tells us like, no, it was science all along. And they knew, and to put that in the timeline, like that wouldn't have been a big deal if they figured that out in Force Awakens or Last Jedi. Yeah. But to think like, oh, this happened 40 years before Ben Kenobi was telling Luke about the Force. Yeah. Then why didn't Ben Kenobi say like, oh, but years later we found out it was just a bunch of tiny little cells.
Yeah. The retconning is really, really tricky.
Yeah, it's interesting, I guess.
Because that's not even one of those things that, I mean, let's talk about something that existed before the internet. If the prequels had come out in today's internet climate, you'd never hear the end of it. And that has nothing to do with a Rose Tycho character or anything. I mean, so many fans would just, the existence of Jar Jar Binks would have exploded Reddit in a fiery blast because people would be, what is this? Like, and it would have been from all sides. It would have been like, what a ridiculous, lame character. Others would have been like, what a racist character. What a like, all of it would have been. And think about 1999. There was consternation, but you'd have it amongst your own immediate friend group. You didn't have this national outrage.
Well, and God, we could seriously continue this discussion forever because that is so interesting to think of. Yeah. So when I saw whatever the Jar Jar Binks one was called, and I went, I'm not bothering with the others. And I just tuned out. Like they lost me as a fan. Whereas like today I would be able to go on Reddit and find the people that agreed with me and have like this little subculture of fans that
start a Kickstarter to remake it.
Yeah. Or something like that. And then it's like, I found my people. But instead what happened was I was like, well, I'm not going to these movies. So I had to go socialize with other people. I sort of had to change a social group sort of thing. I mean, it's not like if I had hung out with an exclusively Star Wars friend group, I'm sure I would have kept hanging out with them. But it would be great to, I want to conduct the thought experiment of what if the prequels were released in the, internet as we know it, but we don't really have to do that because there was a set of prequels released in the days that we know it, The Hobbit, and it was fucking terrible. Yeah. And I think the populace responded appropriately. Whereas the first one came out, huge success, everyone goes to see it, but when this is not The Hobbit, and then the next two just had these sort of faltering audiences, and it's at least the Star Wars prequels, the audience picked up with everyone. I mean, isn't that what we learned? Is that Revenge of the Sith had made the best money or something like that?
Just because Revenge of the Sith was the best
end of
the
it.
Three.
Yeah.
I mean,
and word got out that this one's worth it.
It's worth it, and largely because of Ian McDermott. Like that guy crushed that movie. But I mean, that second one, I forget what the it's Attack of the Clones.
Yeah.
What's the first one? I thought that was Attack. No, that's not Attack of the Clones.
Phantom Menace.
Phantom Menace. Thank you. Yeah, I keep thinking the Darth Maul one. Like they should just call it.
That's funny because all I think of is the pod race one.
No, Darth Maul is the coolest part of that. No, Attack of the Clones was so bad, so stupid on every level that I'm surprised anybody showed up for Revenge of the Sith. And just the presence of Hayden Christensen. So many things went horribly wrong. But you're right. Those movies did. I think because everybody kept thinking, maybe it'll get better. Let's just keep going. Like, surely this time will be the right time. And now it would just, George Lucas sold Star Wars to Disney because everybody yelled at him for making it his way. And he's like, fine, Disney will make it. Quit yelling at me. I have nothing to do with it anymore. Yeah. That's why he sold it. He was glad to keep making them, but everybody kept shouting him down every time he tried to do anything. And he's like, fine, fuck it. Like, let them do it. I can't deal with this.
Which sucks. I mean, that's terrible. And although it's a downer, it's probably a good note to wrap up on, because that's, we've definitely talked, we could keep talking about this subject forever. Mm-hmm. But I feel like we opened with the questions, about the rules and why people, have their own arbitrary rules. They want everything. And there's no better place to end than with George Lucas getting shouted out of, like, arguably one of the greatest sci-fi fantasy creators, of the last 50 years. And he does not want to listen to the public critique his movies anymore, which is super. I mean, like, I'm super as upset as I am about the prequels and the edits to the original trilogy. That is unfair.
It is unfair.
Response to that
and movie. I worry it's a harbinger of things to come.
Yeah.
I worry we're headed, and George R. R. Martin might be dealing with it right now. We've got a bunch of prequels and stuff. Thrones gonna be like when a prop, and it's not just the faults of the fans. When a property becomes so big that there's so much expectation, both from the fans and the corporate side, the money side.
Yeah.
Are you going to be in this situation where, I mean, James Gunn, for God's sake, God bless the fact that he's brought back into that fold, but he was, I mean, that was the corporate side doing it, and the fans were like, no, we want him to stick around, but the corporate side's, well, we're going to lose money if we don't make this decision. There's other elements to that too. The whole merger was going on, so my guess is they wanted to kind of brush aside. But you've got now this sort of public-private thing going on, where it's like the fans have to be served and the corporate money side has to be served. I don't like the prospects for story going into the future under those circumstances.
Yeah. Well, and to put a little question in your head that we don't have to answer in this episode, but just to maybe just sort of like end on, although if you want to answer it, that's fine. But I wonder if that is kind of what we're seeing when J.K. Rowling retcons something, is her exerting a little bit of control over something that's really no longer hers. It is owned in the fans' minds and by large corporations. And so every once in a while she reminds us, like, no, I control this world. And but I'm an outsider looking in on that. I'm not a Harry Potter fan, so I don't have a stake in the game.
That is interesting, though. You're right, because there is so much now beyond her purview.
I guess because I have not heard this in a few years, but I definitely felt like until the Game of Thrones show caught up with George Martin, that every once in a while he was reminding us, like, no, I own this world. He was releasing chapters. He would, do these, like, he would go to conventions and talk about what he was working on and stuff. And it felt like, okay, every time the show deviates, he shows up somewhere and goes like, well, actually Theon is doing this, and now he's kind of gotten trampled and we're not hearing it. But yes, I feel like I have to bring this to a close because we are over an hour.
Please. Yeah,
but really loved this conversation. And I wanted to give some flashbacks to older episodes that we've mentioned. We talked about Rose Tycho in number 74. We talk about hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi and sci-fi fantasy and all that kind of stuff in number 9. We talk about Star Wars in number 12 and number 13. We're going way back on these. So yeah, if you like this discussion, jump back in the Panelism archives and listen to those, which will confusingly be called either Coffee and Comics or the Todd and Taylor Show, but they're all panelism.
It's all panelism at the end of the day. And please subscribe and tell your friends if you like what you heard. Leave a comment wherever you find podcasts. It actually helps us get the word out and helps the show rise in the rankings. So follow us, like us, subscribe, tell your friends, give us feedback. If you didn't like it, if you thought there's a point we didn't cover that you wanted to hear, please let us know. You can find us on Instagram at panelism.inc. That's panelism.ink. And that is also our URL, panelism.ink. Type that into a browser. You'll get all our past shows, other stuff, other cool stuff coming down the pike as well. And we've already promoted our other sister show, so we don't have to do that again.
It's called Wednesday in Westeros.
Wednesday in Westeros. Todd, anywhere folks can find you or any other special personal things you want to promote?
I'm good.
No?
Look, panelism.inc on Instagram. That's our big hangout place.
Didn't you have a game, like a sort of a cool grid board game thing?
I'm still working on it.
Still working on it?
I'll talk about it when it's out.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this was such a pleasure to have this conversation, and it felt like it was the right time after all the Game of Thrones stuff. So
100%.
We will for sure circle back on this, but I think next week, barring some anomaly, we're back to comic books.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, until then, I will see you there, or see you later or something. God damn it.